The fatal shooting of Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old woman killed during a federal immigration and customs enforcement operation in Minneapolis, has exploded into a national political confrontation, one that pits federal authority, immigration enforcement, and officer safety against progressive leaders, activist groups, and what critics describe as a rapidly mobilized protest machine. At the center of the controversy is Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, who stated unequivocally that the shooting was the tragic but lawful result of a woman who, according to federal accounts, spent hours stalking, obstructing, and ultimately endangering ICE agents during a high-risk enforcement operation. Within hours of the shooting, Minneapolis descended into overnight demonstrations, some of which devolved into chaos, blocked roadways, and direct confrontations with police, an all-too-familiar pattern that conservatives say mirrors previous left-wing protest responses anytime federal law enforcement uses force. Noem, woman, shadowed and interfered with agents all day. Speaking at a press conference Wednesday, Noem rejected claims that ICE acted recklessly or without cause. Instead, she painted a picture of sustained interference that escalated into a life-or-death moment. According to Noem, Good repeatedly followed ICE vehicles, inserted herself into enforcement zones, and ignored multiple direct commands to disengage. This was not a slutch encounter, Noem said. This individual refused lawful orders, impeded officers throughout the day, and ultimately attempted to flee in a manner that placed federal agents at immediate risk. Federal officials say agents repeatedly instructed Good to exit her vehicle and stop obstructing the operation. She refused. Video from the scene shows Good's Honda Pilot stopped in the middle of a residential street as agents approached in an unmarked dark gray Nissan Titan. Audio captured Good telling agents to go around her vehicle, despite being ordered to move and exit the car. Moments later, she shifted into reverse. Noem did not mince words when addressing what happened next. She attempted to weaponize her vehicle, Noem said. When a car is used to endanger officers, that is a deadly threat. Law enforcement is trained to respond accordingly. One ICE agent fired, striking Good. She later died from a gunshot wound to the head. While left-wing politicians immediately labeled the shooting an execution, law enforcement experts note that vehicles are among the most common deadly weapons used against officers nationwide, a fact rarely acknowledged by critics of police. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, a longtime critic of ICE and federal immigration enforcement, responded with fury, calling the DHS explanation bullshit and accusing the agency of dishonesty before investigations were complete. Frey's remarks drew sharp criticism from conservatives, who argue that Democratic mayors consistently undermine federal officers while emboldening activists. Critics note that Frey previously told ICE to get the hell out of Minneapolis, comments that resurfaced at one night as protesters flooded the streets chanting anti-ICE slogans. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, another outspoken opponent of aggressive immigration enforcement, escalated rhetoric further by warning the public not to believe what he called the DHS propaganda machine. Walz promised a state-led investigation and suggested federal officials could not be trusted, a stance Republicans argue poisons public confidence and places officers in greater danger. Walz also ordered National Guard units to stand by as demonstrations intensified overnight across Minneapolis and nearby suburbs. By nightfall, activist groups had mobilized. Crowds gathered near the shooting site, blocking intersections, lighting flares, and chanting slogans accusing ICE of murder. Social media posts encouraged protesters to shut down the city, while police scanners reported multiple disturbances. Law enforcement sources confirmed several officers were assaulted with objects during the demonstrations, though no fatalities were reported. Businesses in nearby neighborhoods boarded windows, an image conservatives say has become synonymous with progressive leadership failures. Despite calls from city leaders for a peaceful protest, critics note that the protest began before any verified facts were released, reinforcing claims that outrage, not truth, drives these movements. Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara confirmed that the FBI and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension are jointly leading a federal investigation into the shooting. O'Hara stressed that ICE agents were not under MPD command and that local police were not involved in the use of force. Federal officials emphasized that such investigations are standard protocol whenever lethal force is used. Political lines hardened instantly. Within hours, Capitol Hill erupted. Progressive lawmakers accused ICE of operating as an unchecked paramilitary force, while conservatives accused Democrats of inciting hostility against officers. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez claimed ICE murdered an American citizen. Language critics say prejudges the case and inflames tensions. Republicans countered that such rhetoric invites violence against law enforcement, pointing to years of doxing, harassment, and attacks against ICE agents. Vice President J.D. Vance issued a blistering response on social media, making clear that the administration would not retreat. To the radicals assaulting, threatening, and doxing ICE agents, enforcement will intensify, not retreat. The law will be upheld. Conservatives hailed the statement as a clear contrast to prior administrations that restricted ICE operations amid activist pressure. The shooting occurred amid a large-scale federal operation, deploying 2,000 officers to the Twin Cities, targeting violent criminals, fraud rings, and gang members. DHS officials say the operation was designed to protect communities, but local Democratic leaders openly opposed it, fueling confusion and resistance. Republicans argue that mixed messaging from city and state leaders directly contributes to dangerous confrontations, as civilians are encouraged to interfere with federal operations they politically oppose. As investigators worked through the early morning hours following the fatal ICE shooting of Renee Nicole Good, Minneapolis was already slipping into a familiar pattern. One conservatives argue has become predictable, coordinated, and politically incentivized. By midnight, protest activity had spread far beyond the original scene. Marches moved through residential corridors, activists blocked arterial roads, and social media accounts affiliated with long-standing anti-ICE organizations openly encouraged escalation. Law enforcement sources confirmed that officers were forced to divert emergency traffic as crowds surged into intersections, chanting slogans accusing federal agents of murder, despite the investigation having barely begun. For critics on the right, the speed of the mobilization told its own story. "This wasn't grief," said one former federal official. "This was activation." Minneapolis police confirmed that many of the individuals leading overnight demonstrations were known activists, several of whom had participated in past riots and anti-law enforcement actions dating back years. Flyers circulated online urging supporters to shut the city down and make ICE fear the streets. By dawn, multiple businesses had reported vandalism. Though city leaders attempted to downplay the unrest by labeling it mostly peaceful, scanner traffic and eyewitness footage painted a more chaotic picture: fires lit in barrels, objects thrown at police vehicles, and officers retreating under orders to avoid confrontation. Republicans argue this response has become institutionalized. When Democrat leaders preemptively condemn law enforcement, they send a signal, said a senior GOP aide. That signal is resist, interfere, escalate. As protests raged overnight, national media coverage fractured sharply along partisan lines. Progressive outlets framed the shooting almost exclusively as an execution, often omitting key details acknowledged even in early official statements, such as repeated commands, obstruction, and the vehicle reversing toward agents. Some broadcasts described the ICE operation as random, despite DHS confirming it was part of a targeted enforcement action involving violent criminals and fraud suspects. Conservative commentators accused legacy media of deliberate omission, arguing that framing the incident without context fueled unrest. When you remove agency from the subject and responsibility from activists, you manufacture rage, said one analyst. One of the most contentious elements of the case, largely glossed over in early reporting, is the role of Good's vehicle. Law enforcement training manuals are unequivocal. A moving vehicle used against an officer constitutes deadly force. Federal data shows dozens of officers killed or seriously injured each year by vehicles during traffic stops or enforcement actions. Yet critics note that many outlets describe the moment Good reversed her vehicle as an attempt to leave, not an act that officers could reasonably perceive as a threat. Former ICE supervisors rejected that framing outright. "You don't get to decide in hindsight how an officer should have interpreted a split-second threat," one retired agent said. "That's armchair policing." Democrats double down even as facts emerge. Despite urging calm, Democratic leaders continued to escalate rhetoric. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's claim that ICE murdered an American citizen in cold blood spread rapidly across social media, shared by activist accounts organizing protests. Legal analysts warn that such statements could taint jury pools and undermine due process. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey's vulgar dismissal of DHS claims drew praise from activists, but alarm from law and order advocates who say such language delegitimizes federal authority. Governor Tim Walz's reference to DHS as a propaganda machine further inflamed tensions, reinforcing conservative accusations that Democratic leaders reflexively side against law enforcement regardless of evidence. Perhaps the most explosive development came when DHS sources indicated the incident was being evaluated under domestic terrorism statutes, due to allegations that Good deliberately targeted and interfered with federal agents over an extended period. That characterization ignited immediate backlash from civil liberties groups, but conservatives argue the outrage reveals a double standard. When activists block ICE vehicles or interfere with operations, it's called protest, said a former DOJ official. If conservatives did the same to the FBI, it would be labeled extremism. Supporters of the designation point to DHS definitions that include deliberate obstruction of federal law enforcement through intimidation or force. Behind the political theater, ICE agents report a surge in threats following the shooting. Anonymous online posts circulated personal information of federal officers, a tactic known as doxing that has preceded violent attacks in the past. The National ICE Council warned that demonizing agents place families at risk. "These officers live in the communities they protect," the union said in a statement. "Words have consequences." Vice President J.D. Vance echoed that concern, accusing Democrats of greenlighting harassment. The Minneapolis shooting did not occur in a vacuum. It unfolded amidst the Trump administration's renewed push for aggressive interior enforcement, a policy sharply opposed by sanctuary city leaders. DHS confirmed that the Twin Cities operation targeted individuals with serious criminal records, contradicting claims that ICE was sweeping neighborhoods indiscriminately. Republicans argue that years of anti-ICE rhetoric have encouraged civilians to interfere, falsely believing they are morally justified in obstructing federal law enforcement. "This tragedy is the end result of political incitement," said a GOP lawmaker. "When leaders tell people ICE is illegitimate, someone eventually tests that claim in real life."
The FBI and Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension have emphasized that the investigation will follow evidence, not politics. Still, conservatives question whether justice can remain impartial amidst sustained political pressure, media framing, and street protests. Calls to release the full high-cam footage have intensified, with DHS officials indicating it will be made public once legally permissible. Legal experts caution that early video clips, often stripped of context, can mislead viewers. As Minneapolis awoke after a night of unrest, National Guard units remained on standby. City leaders urged calm, even as activists vowed to continue demonstrations. For many Americans, the shooting has become a proxy battle over far more than one tragic death. It touches immigration, federal authority, media trust, protest culture, and the rule of law itself. Conservatives argue that the central question is being ignored. What happens when civilians are encouraged, implicitly or explicitly, to interfere with armed federal officers? And at what point does protest become provocation?
As protests continued into a second day following the Minneapolis ICE shooting, one reality became increasingly difficult for critics to avoid. Federal agents operate under strict, written use-of-force standards, and those standards exist precisely because situations like this unfold in seconds, not minutes, not hours, and certainly not with the benefit of hindsight. Yet much of the public debate ignored that framework entirely. ICE officers, like all federal law enforcement, are bound by DHS use-of-force policy. Contrary to activist claims, deadly force is not discretionary, emotional, or politically motivated. It is governed by a narrowly defined threshold, imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm to an officer or another person. Critically, DHS policy explicitly recognizes motor vehicles as deadly weapons when used in a manner capable of causing serious harm. That matters. In training materials used across federal agencies, officers are instructed that a suspect who accelerates, reverses, or maneuvers a vehicle towards officers, even briefly, creates an immediate lethal risk. The reason is simple. Once a vehicle begins moving unpredictably in close proximity, there is no reliable way to outrun or deflect it. This is not theoretical. Law enforcement data shows that vehicles consistently rank among the most lethal tools used against officers in the line of duty, often surpassing firearms in certain years. Officers have been crushed between cars, dragged during traffic stops, pinned against walls, and struck while attempting to retreat. These incidents rarely make national headlines unless the officer fires back. Former ICE trainers emphasize that reversing a vehicle towards officers, especially after refusing commands, is treated as a red alert scenario. You don't get a warning shot, one former instructor said. You don't get a negotiation. You get milliseconds. Why she was just leaving is a dangerous narrative. A recurring claim pushed by activists and some media outlets is that Renee Nicole Good was simply trying to leave. Law enforcement experts say that framing is misleading at best and reckless at worst. Context matters. According to DHS statements, Good had allegedly been interfering with agents for hours, inserting herself into enforcement activity, refusing repeated commands, and positioning her vehicle in a way that blocked officers. By the time the shooting occurred, officers were no longer dealing with a neutral bystander. They were dealing with a non-compliant individual actively obstructing an operation. When she reversed the vehicle as agents approached on foot, officers had no way of knowing whether she intended to flee, strike, or pin them. The threat assessment is made before intent is proven, not after. That distinction is routinely ignored by critics. For conservatives, the Minneapolis response fits a now familiar blueprint. Force incident occurs. Political leaders condemn law enforcement immediately. Activist groups mobilize protest within hours. Media coverage amplifies outrage before facts. Investigations are pressured under public fury. Minnesota has seen this cycle repeatedly over the past decade, and each iteration reinforces a lesson activists have internalized. Escalate first, investigate later. Law enforcement veterans warn that such patterns condition civilians to believe interference is justified and even heroic. One of the most overlooked elements of the Minneapolis unrest is how closely protest behavior tracked political messaging. When Mayor Jacob Frey dismissed DHS claims with profanity, that language was echoed almost verbatim on protest signs and chants hours later. When Governor Tim Walz accused DHS of propaganda, activists cited those remarks while blocking roads. This is not coincidence. Political leaders serve as permission structures. When they delegitimize federal authority, they lower the psychological barrier for confrontation. Republicans argue that Good's actions, if proven accurate, did not emerge in isolation, but in an environment where anti-ICE rhetoric has been normalized for years. Minneapolis's long-standing sanctuary posture has created a unique tension between local leadership and federal enforcement. City officials routinely signal that ICE is unwelcome, unnecessary, or morally suspect, yet lack the authority to prevent federal operations. This contradiction breeds confusion among residents, some of whom come to believe they are empowered to intervene physically. Federal officials say that misconception is dangerous. You don't get to veto federal law with your body, one DHS source said. That's how people get hurt. Why DHS used the term domestic terrorism? The term domestic terrorism sparked outrage, but conservatives argue the reaction reveals selective outrage rather than legal inconsistency.
Under federal definitions, domestic terrorism includes actions intended to intimidate or coerce government operations through force or obstruction. It does not require ideological affiliation, explosives, or mass casualties. If investigators determine that Good deliberately followed, obstructed, and endangered federal agents over an extended period, DHS officials say the classification would be legally grounded, even if politically uncomfortable. Critics counter that the label is excessive. Supporters respond that the same label has been used far more loosely in other contexts with far less pushback. The Minneapolis incident has intensified an already volatile climate for ICE personnel. According to internal DHS briefings, threats against ICE officers have surged in recent years, including death threats, stalking, and coordinated doxing campaigns. Agents report being followed home, confronted in grocery stores, and harassed online. The rhetoric matters. When public figures label ICE fascists, murderers, or paramilitary occupiers, it creates an atmosphere where violence against agents feels justified to fringe actors. Vice President J.D. Vance's warning that enforcement will increase, not retreat, was intended to send a message not just to activists but to agents themselves. The federal government will not abandon them. Despite public fury, legal analysts caution that the ICE officer involved may ultimately be cleared. Use of force cases hinge on objective reasonableness, not emotional response or political optics. Courts evaluate what a reasonable officer would perceive in that moment, not what observers conclude days later with slowed video and commentary. If investigators confirm repeated commands, obstruction, proximity, and vehicle movement, prosecutors may find the use of force justified under federal standards. That outcome, conservatives warn, could further inflame activists, who have increasingly equated legal clearance with injustice. As National Guard units remained on standby and protests threatened to continue, Minneapolis found itself confronting the same unresolved question it has faced repeatedly. Will political leaders prioritize rule of law or political alignment with activist outrage? Republicans argue that until that question is answered differently, these confrontations will continue. The tragedy, they say, is not just the loss of life, but the refusal to confront how rhetoric, resistance, and reflective condemnation set the stage.